Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining the Confidential Advocacy Program and our webinar series. Today, we are here joined by Dr. Hsu and talking about ways to support Asian survivors of trauma and violence. My name is Stephanie McClure, and I'm the director of CAP. As we begin today, I would like to just take a moment to acknowledge the original people of the land that we now call Portland and Multnomah County, where the traditional lands of the Multnomah, Klamath, Clackamas, Tumwater, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Wasco, Molalla, Cowlitz, and Watlala bands of the Chinook and many others, as well as the Chinook Nation and the Cowlitz Nation in Washington State. CAP thanks the original caretakers of this land. If you are new and just learning about CAP for the first time, we started in 2018. And we are here to provide support, advocacy, and resources to OHSU members who experience sexual harassment, assault, relationship violence, and or stalking. You can go to the next slide, please. Today, none of our speakers have any disclosures to make. We want to just point out some accessibility available. Thank you to EdCom and Language Services for providing ASL interpretation. You also are able to access closed captioning through the following link. At CAP, our mission is to center the voices of those who've experienced sexual misconduct and violence at OHSU through education, advocacy, empowerment, connection, and support. We envision an equitable and safe OHSU community that embodies anti-oppressive values, inclusivity, and positive relationships free of violence. The values that our work is grounded in include social justice, intersectionality, inclusion and equity, self-determination, and safety and health. At CAP, we are here to listen, to affirm, and validate and support our members. We're here to connect you to resources, to provide you with information, and to support you in strategizing and safety planning, as well as to advocate and coordinate workplace and or educational interventions and support measures. We offer many additional services. Please feel free to just give us a call at any time, 24/7, on whatever line is closest to the location that you are at, and let us know what you're needing support around, and we'll do what we can to support. All right, so beyond the services I just spoke about, I'd like to just highlight that we currently have trauma-informed yoga available at ohsu.edu/CAP, our website, with sessions as short as 5 minutes long, all the way up to an hour long. We are also offering virtual art therapy and art therapy program that you can access at whatever time makes the most sense for you. This is also available at our website. As it is our mission to center the voices of those impacted by violence at OHSU, we have started a program this last summer called Rising Voices. Rising Voices allows CAP to engage in advocacy work beyond the individual level, and it allows survivors to support each other and build collective power at OHSU. Members who participate in Rising Voices tell us, staff at CAP, what we should be advocating for, whether that be around policy, procedures, or pathways that folks access in their struggle to address discrimination and harassment, or new programs and services that are needed at OHSU to support folks dealing with these issues. Participation, as with all CAP services, is confidential and privileged. We invite any member at OHSU who has been impacted by these things and has feedback on ways that OHSU could have or did respond, on ways that your department could have or did respond, or would like to share any sort of supports or services that would be helpful for you. Please contact us with that information. Additionally, we know that violence disproportionately impacts the communities that are often most marginalized in society. This includes people of color, LGBTQ+ folks, people with disabilities, people from working class backgrounds, and especially those with multiple identities that have historically been marginalized. We believe that these communities must be centered in the work that we do at CAP, and therefore we are forming an advisory council for rising voices that is specifically made up of OHSU members who are a part of these communities or who are members of other marginalized communities. If you're interested in joining, please reach out to us at capsupport@ohsu.edu. I am incredibly thrilled and extremely grateful to OHSU's administration as well as the Human Resources Department to be able to share with our audience today that beginning this spring, CAP is going to be able to officially start offering advocacy services to OHSU members who have experienced race-based discrimination at OHSU. This is whether or not folks have experienced sexual misconduct as well. To start developing these new services, we are going to be hiring 2 new advocates who specialize in providing culturally specific services for BIPOC communities. We invite any OHSU member that is interested and would like to provide input on the position descriptions that we're putting together right now, as well as services that you think should be provided as a part of this new expansion. And or if you are interested in being able to participate in the hiring process. CAP is going to be offering for every final candidate the opportunity to meet with all of our BIPOC folks at OHSU in a public forum. So folks have an opportunity to ask questions and to learn more about each candidate and provide their input on which candidate they would like to join the CAP team. If you're interested in getting involved with any of these things, please feel free to reach out to us at capsupport@ohsu.edu, and we'll add you to the listserv where we will be sending out more information about these things. Okay, so I'd like to now start transitioning to the webinar content. As mentioned, we are joined today by Dr. Hsu, who is an Asian American specialist, a psychologist, a lecturer at Stanford, and the former president of the Asian American Psychological Association. Her work has primarily focused on intersectional, diverse communities, culturally responsive treatment, and mentorship and leadership training of psychology students. She serves as a consultant for the Netflix series 13 Reasons Why and has authored several book chapters on clinical topics throughout her career. Today, she is joining us to talk about best practices in supporting Asian survivors of trauma and violence. Thank you so much, Dr. Hsu, for your time and for helping all of us to grow and learn how to better support our Asian communities here at OHSU and throughout the state. If at any time during Dr. Hsu's talk you have questions for her, we encourage you to send us an email at capsupport@ohsu.edu. Unfortunately, we do not have chat features available at this webinar today. Stacy, our advocate coordinator, will be monitoring the inbox and will be reading these questions during the question and answer period at the end. If you need any additional support or advocacy support throughout this webinar, please feel free to give us a call at our hotline, 833-495-CAPS. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Stephanie, for this welcome. And I'm really excited, too, to actually hear about all the changes and growth that CAPS is undergoing. I wanted to go over that briefly. I'm hoping at the end of this time, participants will be able to identify some key characteristics within the AAPI communities, identify cultural and generational factors that may be relevant to supporting AAPI survivors, their reporting, their treatment, and integrate cultural factors when determining the best practice interventions for AAPIs during assessment and beyond. And in light of that, I've brought some case vignettes because sometimes that helps us to apply some of the theoretical knowledge, and we'll have some time to look at those. And I really look forward to actually hopefully receiving some questions and thoughts about that, and also thoughts that may be relevant more to your population that you're serving. Okay, so let me And just a bit about myself. I'm coming to you from California, Northern California, on unceded Ohlone lands. Myself, I have Chinese and Mongolian ancestry, but I was born in Taiwan. I see that as my birthplace homeland, but I do not call myself Taiwanese because there were indigenous peoples there of multiple kinds. And my family came to flee the communists and basically established martial law in Taiwan. Immigrated to San Francisco when I was a toddler and have been here ever since. Now, a lot of my work has been in community-based mental health, actually started in hospice and geriatric care. But for the purposes of this topic, the relevant experience, Asian Community Mental Health Services in Oakland, Asian Pacific Family Center in Southern California. Came to Stanford Counseling and Psychological Services as an Asian American specialist to serve our students who are about 25% Asian American or Asian, and past president of the Asian American Psychological Association, which is a nationwide agency organization. Kind of as a starting point is to really clarify who are we even talking about? Who are Asian Americans? Right, we're a minority in the United States, but they're actually the global majority. And in the United States, we're currently approximately 6% of the total population. But we are the fastest growing group between the years 2000 and 2015. The AAPI population grew actually by 72%. So within about 50 years, it's estimated AAPIs may be the largest minority group within the United States, actually even surpassing Latinx communities. Of course, part of the reason we're big is that we are actually a whole bunch of groups and communities. The largest subgroups that you're most likely to work with are Chinese ancestry, Indian, South Asian Indian, and Filipino ancestry communities. But there are more than 20 countries of ancestry that comprise this population. Often they came here tied to factors in U.S. history, clearly after the Vietnam War, but also lesser known communities like the Hmong and the Lao. And Filipinos who have a long colonial history also with the United States. About 26% of Asian Americans live in a multi-generational household, so maybe including grandparents as well as children. And that's a big feature that has impacted wellness. Obviously, in the age of COVID, it has been a risk factor, but it impacts help seeking as well. 68% actually do speak a language other than English at home. It's a very large percentage and many, many different languages. So primarily it's important to think about our intergroup diversity and disparities. That if there's one big point I'd like you to always remember about AAPIs is that we're an extremely bimodal demographic community. And I'll talk a little more about what that means. It's really important to disaggregate data whenever you're trying to study or learn about Asian Americans because we are the most bimodal community on almost every measure. So this graph is just talking about, for example, income, that we have some of the absolute lowest income communities within our group and some of the absolute highest. This goes for factors such as level of education as well. The problem is that when you take this super bimodal, almost reverse of a normal bell curve feature for our population and put it all together and lump us as one group, you just kind of see a normal bell curve. And so a lot of communities with very serious needs get left out of the picture. So as you can see, especially some of the newest immigrant groups like Hmong, Bangladeshi, Cambodian, and Thai communities have a lot more economic strife than communities that have been here a lot longer, like Filipino, Chinese, Asian Indian. Okay. And another thing about not using phenotype, about trying to identify who's AAPI, right, is getting really into the most common Asian American microaggression experiences There's some really fabulous information on the Rutgers Asian American Cultural Center website, including this graphic here where students really just talked about the most common microaggressions they experience. The main one is being the perpetual foreigner. So looking at someone and perhaps trying to reach out and be supportive about do they have language needs or something, and they feel very insulted because they may be a fifth generation American and are really tired of being asked like where they came from. My brother is a USMC, and that for him is a huge like microaggression, that I'm an American, I've served this country, and yet I'm always being labeled as a foreigner. You're all the same, the interchangeable assumption. I've had therapists who are really trying to make a connection with the client, try to bring up something that may be a shared experience, like, I've adopted an Asian child, or I've been to Japan or something, and it comes off as very microaggressive instead. And the model minority myth that, again, looking at the previous bimodal demographic, that not all of us are good at math or very wealthy or work in tech, and that model minority myth can kind of hide a lot of the needs in the community. However, caregiver match, service provider match is not required. It's impossible to access perfect intersectional matches, of course, and actually members of small communities might often prefer a non-match. When I've served smaller communities like Afghani Americans, Cambodian Americans, they're often really worried about the social circles overlapping, and they might actually very much feel safer with someone who is not from the community. And validation from someone outside the community can actually be quite powerful. I've worked especially with young people who are maybe struggling with their cultural identities and values, and have actually felt very validated when it's actually, say, for example, a white therapist who is helping them to see that maybe the love language of their parents is different, but not necessarily worse. And there's a saying among a lot of therapists of color about how skin folk aren't always kinfolk, that the best therapist or caregiver or service provider might not be someone who just necessarily maybe phenotype kind of looks the same. There's a lot of issues within our communities about internalized racism, colonial mentality, colorism, and so sometimes the best match is actually not someone who may also be Asian American. That we're a very intersectional community. Of some examples here of client pseudonyms, of course, right? Eugene has had very negative anti-Black experiences within his Korean American community. Or Eloisa is seeking support outside of her Catholic Filipino community to support her child who just came out as genderqueer. Nor is a Thai American woman searching for a healthcare team who actually understands deaf culture, because that's actually her primary culture. Or Ishani had to fire her East Asian therapist who denied that colorism within Asian American communities exists and held biases against South Asians. So as I point out to people often, not only can we not be seen necessarily as the same, we have actually had histories of oppression or even war against one another in our ancestral countries in the past. And so being sensitive to some of those factors. And, as already mentioned in the CAP guidelines, that we're always trying to work from a position of cultural humility, right? It's this ongoing process that requires the humility. Each of us has something of great value to learn from the other. Individuals continually engage in self-reflection and self-critique as lifelong learners and reflective practitioners. To redress power imbalances, to develop mutually beneficial, non-paternalistic partnerships in care. I was educated in a generation that we talked about cultural competence, which treated it more like this is a thing you learn about different groups and you kind of are competent. And I really do appreciate the shift in later years to this idea of humility, that we are always learning. and always have a place to grow and to think very specifically about the power issues. There's a picture of Mickey Mouse there, which may feel very random, but I remember Dr. Kuznier when I was at La Familia Counseling, who really talked about thinking about Mickey Mouse in this work, just having really gigantic ears and a very small mouth. And that image has stuck with me in terms of how we address this work. And cultural humility is an ongoing goal. So I know at our CAPS have been talking a lot about how to move beyond DEI to real liberation and humility in work. And so, for example, I've really identified that ableism is an area that I'm really needing to put in the most work. So thinking about where that might be at each stage of your career. One of the things to really be mindful of to avoid some of the pitfalls mentioned earlier about misidentifying or inadvertently microaggressing against an Asian American client is the very first thing in assessment is really noting how exactly does your client self-identify, right? Are they an international student? That's a huge population, for example, that I work with. Are they an immigrant? And if so, what was their experience? There's a giant gulf between someone who came as a toddler like myself and someone who maybe came in high school or much later or as an adult with family or as an elder person. There's actually a pretty high suicide rate among Asian elders in the United States because it is such an isolating experience. So really, do they identify as an immigrant? Are they an adoptee? That could be a whole other series of talks about the experiences of transracial adoptees, that there are many Asian adoptees. Do they consider themselves an Asian American? That they are second generation, third generation, or beyond? That many Asian Americans may have parents who themselves do not speak any other language and are completely more attuned to mainstream US culture. There's a growing population of people who refer to themselves as third culture kids. And what's that? It's actually getting beyond the binary of even being Asian and just US. So third culture kids are people who spent a significant amount of their life, perhaps, in a culture that was not their parental or birth homeland, but is also not where they're living now. So this may be the child who they are Asian ancestry, but they lived and were born in Brazil for a while, but then they decided to move to the United States. It could be the child of expats who are working abroad. So third culture kids are actually creating a body of work more to address their identity experiences, and they're often multilingual. A very important group to talk about, the photo here is from our Alameda County Pacific Islander gathering, that you'll often hear the terms interchanged, and I myself will do it. I will talk about Asian Americans, but also AAPIs, Pacific Islanders, or AANHPI, Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders. And being careful to ask them where they situate themselves. So for example, the Asian American Psych Association did not change our name to the AAPI Psych Association because I feel it would be claiming to be something we're not. We don't have enough Pacific Islanders in leadership to truly feel we represent them. And at the Stanford campus, our Native Hawaiian Pacific Islander students often feel much more closely aligned at the Native American Community Center than they do at the Asian American Community Center. So really allowing people to locate themselves where they are. And you will sometimes hear a newer term, APIDA, Asian Pacific Islander Desi Americans, and Desi referring to really acknowledging the experiences of South Asians. So I have a picture here of the division of South Asian Americans. DOSA is a division within the Asian American Psych Association. So really addressing that they have unique experiences. And that very often They've created a hashtag, even, brown Asians exist, that a lot of South Asians and Filipinos feel excluded from primarily Asian American spaces, which tend to be dominated by East Asians. But really getting into trauma survivors. So with all that background, you've tried to figure out where it is your clients self-identify. And then what are the barriers to help seeking? There's huge cultural stigma. Of course, every culture has stigma, especially about sexual violence. But for a lot of Asian American communities, that is sort of magnified. That sexuality is not something that is often addressed openly at all. Many have a great fear of authorities and distrust of oppressive classes and hierarchy, that many of our home countries have very powerful hierarchies, experiences with oppression, corruption, that make them very fearful of seeking support here. Some may have actually had negative experiences within the United States as well. Feeling that maybe they can't report, it would never be taken seriously, or that they don't trust, they would not have backlash. There's a great number of people, especially from older generations, with intergenerational trauma that they're also bringing in. That could be a barrier to help seeking. Language access is huge. Maybe obviously not for like the 5th generation person, but especially under duress, we will often have a harder time using our 2nd or 3rd language. So for example, like my parents lived in the United States for 40 years. They were obviously fully functional, literate, working, spoke English. But under stress and when they are sick or needing health care, they absolutely in every way prefer their first language and struggle to navigate complex bureaucracies or sensitive topics in their 2nd language. Legal knowledge. Now, again, this may be true for just about everybody, but especially for newer immigrants and APIs, they may not have any idea what are their legal rights and how to access legal support. There may be real resource barriers, economic, transportation, again, informational, and immigration status. One of the things about Asian Americans is that we are actually the largest group with undocumented populations, but you rarely hear about that. And there's complicated cultural reasons, but unlike, for example, the Latinx community, which has worked to advocate for themselves and really fight for legal rights, in a lot of AAPI communities, it's a shameful secret. It's something people are very frightened about. And so it's a huge population of people who are actually undocumented and may be afraid to speak out in any way because of that. Okay. And an example from a vignette that, what are the barriers that come into play, right? So Jessie's Burmese immigrant parents are livid about her sexual assault by her uncle, Win. They're shaking with rage, but they tell her, we cannot afford to live separately from Uncle. He sponsored our immigration papers. And no one will marry you if they know. The police might victimize you too. Grandma would die to hear of it. All we can do is pray and try to forget. So multiple factors intersecting here. They're financially dependent. They're protecting grandma. There's a saving face element. Nolan Zane has published some excellent papers about psychology of saving face as a cultural value. This cultural stigma, no one will marry you if you're a survivor. The fear and distrust of authorities, the idea that the police might actually victimize you because that may have been their experience in Burma. Language barriers, legal knowledge, and immigration status. Which brings us to cumulative trauma. As you all know, that exposure to multiple sources or types of traumas or events that stress an individual's coping mechanisms and threatens harm to self or others. That cumulative trauma, such as racial discrimination, sexual harassment, systemic oppression, is more likely to correlate with chronic health disturbances than single exposure trauma. Simply put, cumulative effects of multiple victimization experiences are more likely to cause psychological and physiological symptoms. And I also recall in my training years that we tended to focus on single incident traumas, but actually almost always in my community-based work, especially serving economically stressed neighborhoods and primarily immigrants, that most of them came in with cumulative trauma. So although they may have come following an assault, a major mental health breakdown, we often assessed multiple cumulative traumas, whether they actually refer to those as traumas or not. So that's something to, in your assessment, to think about the way we ask. There was a recent study that when asking young people about racially motivated bullying, most of them did not identify themselves as victims of bullying. But when surveys asked, have you experienced certain things, and named things like being called racial slurs, they said yes. So there's sometimes a gap in the words we're using, and how they experience it, right? So they may not call it cumulative trauma or systemic oppression, but actually as a professional, when you assess, you may identify that's actually what a lot of these adverse events have been. How does this look in the community? Another example, 15-year-old Viana was molested by a youth pastor at camp. She said something to her pediatrician, which led to a report being made. But her parents were terrified when authorities called the home. Her mother refused to believe this because, quote, only white people have these kind of sick behaviors. Viana's dad has PTSD from a police beating back in Vietnam. They live in a multi-generational home where Viana's Auntie Lena is undocumented. A social worker was able to provide informational materials in Vietnamese. And after understanding more about the situation, her parents do want justice and safety for Viana, but they fear retaliation, right? So you could imagine there's multiple points here that perhaps you could provide education or resources or support. The Vietnamese informational materials is sometimes really crucial. It may sound, naive or ridiculous that her mother actually believed only white people have these behaviors, or I've heard people say only white people have mental health. But when you think about how powerful the cultural stigma is, that they may have literally never heard of this, even though our data show this occurs equally as much as in any other community, but they never hear of it. So that informational and psychoeducation material might be a huge step just to get started. We often find in intakes with Black, Indigenous, people of color, Asian Americans, immigrants, we spend way more time on the psychoeducational part of counseling intake so they know what to expect. And we try not to assume, because we find many of them had families or communities that never spoke about these things. So it's unclear what's even the scope of the problem. But from what we do know in the US, immigrant and refugee women do experience rates of domestic violence, depending on the study, ranging from 30% to 50%. The API Domestic Violence Resource Project study found that 41 to 60% of Pacific Islander women reported sexual violence from a domestic partner. And if you look at national rates of sexual assault reports by AAPI women, they are lower. They look lower than other groups. But it's impossible to know how this is correlated with cultural factors, which greatly discourage and prevent disclosure. Asian Americans Advancing Justice had highlighted, for example, the work of Amanda Nguyen, who is a Vietnamese American survivor and became a civil rights activist and advocate, and has actually been able to enact policy change. And so her presence has been huge for many younger generation Asian Americans who are trying to break stigmas. At Stanford, we have the sort of 51st words that you might say to somebody who discloses a sexual trauma or harassment or assault. Modified it a little bit for a communal-oriented person, an Asian American. I'm sorry that somebody hurt you. How can I help? OHSU has resources to support you. You decide what to do next that is best for you and your family. Would you like to speak to a confidential counselor? We can explain your reporting and care options. We can provide translated information. We want you to feel safe. You can take the time you need to think about this. The asterisks, right? Translated information. It might not even be for the person in front of you. It could be for their parents. I've worked with survivors at Stanford that really need help disclosing to, say, a parent. And they don't know how to explain. One of the features, for example, in a multi-generational immigrant household is we have literally had younger generations clients who do not know even the vocabulary in their first language, to say the least of how to talk about something so sensitive. And so the translate information may be for the client or the person in front of you, or it may be for family or community members. I added the what is best for you and your family piece, because one of the frequent complaints that collectivist culture people give about seeking support from white Western helpers is that the helpers really promote an empowerment narrative. What do you need? Do what's best for you. Forget everybody else. And that just fundamentally won't work for a lot of collectivist cultures. That is just selfish. It's going back on my values. I actually don't know if I can be healthy or happy without my community. That loss might be too much. And it needs to be, as we empower a survivor, their choice how and when to set a boundary. Another example of how this works is there's a small but growing body of literature that coming out stories for queer AAPIs are often a family coming out, a process a family does together rather than one person. So for survivors, is this something that you want to do with family and community, or is this something you need to do on your own? We can talk about all these options. And the translate information, which will normalize as well. Because we've also heard students say things like, I've never known, or I've never heard about anyone else, say, in my community experiencing this. So it can be very validating to be able to provide those resources with facts and relatable other community members. But supporting AAPI survivors, this graphic is from Asian Women's Shelter, which was based in San Francisco, has grown. It's a really great program for AAPI domestic violence survivors. So Asian Women's Shelter is a great resource, trainers as well. But for all of us, how do we support AAPI survivors best, right? I think I can see a lot of the work in the sort of mission statement is already underway. Establishing an agency culture of culturally responsive practices, engaging in our cultural humility. Really doing the difficult work of being trauma-informed and sitting with the fact that you cannot be trauma-informed if you are not also an anti-racist organization. That trauma is so much a part of racism and systemic oppression that these are actually the same kinds of work. Engaging in outside consultations regularly, creating language access plans, accessibility plans of all kinds, intersectional resources, and providing training and ongoing feedback measures, including from the community about how are things going. Because there's so many intersectional aspects to who we serve, this is so valuable. As a midlife person, for example, who works with a young population, we've often needed feedback about what their preferences are in terms of support and education. One example is that as we entered the pandemic era, our students made it very clear that they wanted a lot of videos, and they wanted them to be short and plentiful, which was very different than what was the style of our clinicians, who were often not super comfortable on camera and tended to give long workshop-y lecture type videos. So getting that feedback. And we're also hearing things now about international students are extra isolated and extra fearful because of the xenophobia of this last year. So ongoing feedback from the community can really help guide you in investing resources in what is the most supportive and timely. So in advance, you can work on building your resource list for consultation. At AAPA, we often get a lot of very desperate emails for immediate consult. It's very hard to respond to those kind of situations. So if you can build your collaborators, ahead, really evaluating hiring and leadership representation. I appreciate that the hiring positions going on now, asking for feedback. That's also something that we've, unfortunately only very recently started doing more of at Stanford, is running the job postings by community and asking, are we missing anything? Do we need to really make sure? So how can we keep hiring people who are best at serving this population? And thinking about leadership representation. Really cultivating in advance your network of allies and accomplices, and that can include spiritual leaders and elders. And community outreach and presentations to build your agency reputation as being trustworthy. So this photo here is from a huge gathering, largely of elders in Oakland, California. And I don't know if you can see clearly, but these little flags and signs actually have different languages. So the community came out and the different language groups had translation available to make sure that they could really understand how they could access. In this case, we were talking about covered California, so health insurance. But building that resource and that network in advance, I can't stress it enough. One of the most rewarding things about my role at the Asian American Psych Association was actually strengthening my work with the Association of Black Psychologists, the Society of Indian Psychologists, and the National Latinx Psych Association. And so having a relationship of exchange, of supporting each other as accomplices, and having consult, reliable consult, handy. Right. And consider integrating indigenous forms of healing. Elder advocates or counsel. We visited Waianae Health Center in Hawaii, and they have a kapuna, an elder council, that reviews everything they do at the medical center for cultural appropriateness for Native Hawaiians. Youth advocates and counsel, right? Generationally, what are the best ways to serve young people? Spiritual support and ceremonies, art therapies, movement therapies, again, really amazing to hear how CAP has that going, different programs. Community healing activities, that sometimes our best healing is in groups, not just an individual. Creation-focused engagement, that you may hear a lot of marginalized communities now feel very tired, emotional labor, beleaguered. How can we focus on creating things in our engagement so that they don't feel I'm just providing labor or consults, but we're not getting anything back. We're not actually in charge of creating something. And of course, working with established community organizations, because you don't have to remake the wheel. There are groups that are probably already doing a lot of work, already have established a lot of trust, and seeing how you could partner. But definitely using your community consults to check in about this. So for example, some of us who are East Asian had to learn that a Cambodian temple, that we knew many people there and worked well with them, that there was a rift within the community. And so we actually had to learn that we can't just use this one temple because it would leave out many others in this population in terms of trusting our organization. So using those community consults. So how do we learn and strengthen in mutuality, right? No one is being anybody's savior. We're all learning from this. If you have not heard of it, this photo is from Merced Medical Center, that in Central California, they've established a certification program where Hmong shamans actually learn about the medical center, and they also provide spiritual care and community liaisonship with the community. And they've had great outcomes about people being more willing to come, trusting the system more, doing more preventative care instead of waiting for crises. So it's a mutually beneficial experience. Okay, and as we move into some case vignettes and hopefully then have some time to dialogue, just please imagine yourself face to face with this person. These are all composite vignettes, but of real situations. And maybe jot down what aspects of their concerns do you find most relatable, or which aspects do you feel the most unsure about understanding or assessing? Do you feel like you've had adequate training and experience to serve this client? And what resources would you like to have in responding to this client situation? Okay, so it'd be great if you kind of note questions and jot them down for when we have some time at the end. So case vignette Rick. Rick is an international student from Singapore, and he felt honored and lucky that a prestigious faculty member agreed to be an advisor for his research. He's come to your hospital for STD tests. The MD grows concerned about Rick's clear distress regarding circumstances of intercourse. Rick mumbles that he can't report anything, as he willingly traveled to an academic conference on Professor Burns's dime. Staff want him to advocate for himself, but Rick seems frightened that hospital staff probably know Professor Burns from within the university system. So he left without taking action, and staff felt pretty badly. And the next vignette, there's 3 here. Case vignette of Amina. You're the clinical supervisor for a psychology trainee therapist, Pam, working with a 17-year-old Afghan-American teen named Amina. Pam is extremely upset and having reactions to the fact that Amina is married to a 30-year-old man chosen by her parents. Amina is not happy with the match, but agreed to the marriage as her obligation to family. And, by the way, it is legal to marry at 17 in Oregon if your parents approve. You're concerned that the trainee, Pam, may be unable to provide proper care. Okay. And the next vignette. For Preet, you are the clinician who called a meeting with Preet and a police officer because her second grade daughter alluded to disturbing events at home. Preet is tearful, anxious, vague. 40-minute session, won't make eye contact. Admits her marriage is unhappy and her husband is, quote, rude. The officer stands to leave as there is nothing that meets criteria for reporting. Preet blurts out that she was raped in front of their daughter. The officer is exasperated and suspicious. Why Preet didn't state this up front? And so hopefully having the case vignettes really gives you a chance to think on how this would work in your system. And that this would be a great time, I guess, going through. Stacy, if you have questions, comments, and discussion. This piece of art here is actually Chanel Miller art. She actually recently had an exhibit at the Asian Museum, Asian American Art Museum in San Francisco. But Chanel Miller, for those who may not be familiar, is a multiracial Asian woman who was raped on Stanford campus, who became very outspoken. She wrote Know My Name. She created a lot of art. And so I know also for a lot of our younger generation Asian Americans, she has been a powerful figure about a survivor taking back her name and her healing story.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hsu. That was super wonderful and informative. For those who want to provide some feedback or questions regarding the vignettes that she's mentioned, again, you can email capsupport@ohsu.edu. And we do have some questions. Let's see here. So Dr. Hsu, how would you suggest someone ask if it would be helpful to have translation services and or print materials without creating harm or engaging in a macro or microaggression?
Mm-hmm. That is such a great question, right? How to delicately inquire. If you think about it, it might be a little bit similar if you're dealing with someone that you just don't know how to inquire about low literacy. You just don't want to be insulting, but you want to be helpful. I would say sort of precluding an offer with, it's often hard to remember or communicate when you're really distressed. So would something be helpful if it's written, or sending you a resource or pamphlet? Would you like that in English and any other languages in case you may want to share? And just having that option be there. Yeah. I think just normalizing that, yeah, the distress part of why they may want something additional to look at when they have a little more time and space, or would they like to go over it together with you? And is there anyone that they would like to share with that you can get the information to? You know, and this is for survivors, but even in general mental health work, we found this has often been really important. So I've actually searched the web wide for resources in multiple languages that can be shared with family members. But yes, and sometimes even acknowledging, like, I know you're a student here and you're obviously like fluent. Just wanted to ask if you want resources to read up about this later in English, or also if you or your family or partner or anybody might be interested in additional things and I can provide them or I can find them. Because that's the other thing. I know we don't all have all of it at our fingertips, but we can help them find it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We do have a few other questions. Do you have any suggestions as to ways that academic medical institutions can help to prevent retaliation and increase trust in API communities, that they will be protected by the institution if they do experience retaliation?
Mm-hmm. Such a great question that gets to, academia, the hierarchy and the power differentials that are still extremely present. That's definitely a policy level piece. I think, for example, movements like hiring an advocate can be very powerful, and making sure that they are empowered in some way. So, for example, I've talked with a campus that had an ombudsperson, but basically the students didn't utilize her because it really felt clear that she had no real influence, and just felt like someone to talk to, but who couldn't help them in any way, any practical way, right? And so even creating, and also another thing we found, in addition to videos, which students like very much, they also really like infographics, but maybe outlining what are your steps, right? Who are the people who can actually stand there with you and support you if there is retaliation? I'm very grateful, for example, at Stanford, do we call in the Office of Accommodations if there's something related to that? Our graduate school deans are actually able to consult confidentiality and have sometimes negotiated things with a department or an advisor. And it's very difficult because the other structural piece is to actually work with the department's staff and faculty and really have that buy-in, that how do we ensure if something has happened, there isn't retaliation, especially when sometimes these situations we can't necessarily reveal all the information, right? But an example of how a healthy department might work is we did have a student who transferred from another college because of a very negative incident with a faculty member and was terrified of being blacklisted in their field. And at least, had some allied faculty who helped with her doing a very strong transfer application, really advocated for her, didn't know the details of what had happened, but knew that something was inappropriate, the student was not to blame, and really worked to facilitate her success elsewhere. It was still extraordinarily hard. The student had to move to another campus, another state, but really thinking about those factors, right? Some of us, like myself, a clinician, we're really good at your healing and safety, but institutions really need to think about being blacklisted academically or on the job market, not getting that letter of rec, and how can we intervene, right? If I'm in charge of a department and I'm aware that something has occurred here, I need to take the initiative to provide that letter of rec and not have maybe this advisor do it. Or really taking a role from a power position to protect that student. And when that hasn't happened, because it varies wildly from department to department, I'm sure your campus as well as mine, then I know some of our students have just taken to the public sphere to fight for their own advocacy. The power of Twitter shaming a famous institution is a fascinating thing. Or they have actually left their department and sought support in others. So, for example, Michelle Dauber in our law school is a fierce advocate for survivor rights and women's rights, and many students have sought her out. So, who are the safe people who have attained tenure and power, who can actually be reliable allies for a student going through this?
Thank you for that. That's, I think, a really important thing to talk about with this presentation. We have another question for you, Dr. Hsu. How can providers take a strength-based approach with this community when intervening with cumulative trauma?
Yes. That's great. A strength-based approach for cumulative trauma. A lot of it is trying to empower people to identify what's happened as a first step. Part of the way internalized racism has worked, or colonial mentalities, I've met a lot of AAPIs who sometimes have very deficit-based ideas even about their own communities, right? And you may listen for that. I've literally met young people who are like, oh, you know, this is just a messed up thing about all Vietnamese Americans, which is really sad. It's like, well, actually, let's talk about trauma, you know, in your community, as opposed to just some kind of deficit with your parents' entire generation. So the awareness, really looking at naming things, the validation that, of course, people might react this way. That is not the healthiest, but it's a reaction, and it's an attempt at coping. And trying to shift to the terminology. Like I know in general with the sexual assault survivor approaches, does someone prefer the term, you know, victim? Do they prefer the term survivor? Like, what is the word that works for them? We talk a lot. There's actually a very exciting growing body that talks about ancestral or multi-generational trauma, but also moves toward resilience and liberation. And so sometimes shifting to this language of we need to grieve. Maybe there are things that need to be grieved, but also the upside of the empowering aspects and the strength-based aspects of you could be someone who actually changes intergenerational patterns or is the one who brings in help for cumulative trauma. And it's also why, although, you know, I work in a place where we generally practice as an individual clinician, I'm always assessing the larger picture because I know it'll be a lot better if I can address multiple things, because there have been times I have a student in very acute mental health crisis. There's plenty for me to deal with here. But then we're discovering that grandma has had these experiences and these symptoms that the family has hidden and managed for years. Parents have these issues. And so the strength-based of you can actually be the change maker. I can give you resources or tools to consider potentially for everybody. And the other thing too is that sometimes, especially with more recent immigrants, they want strength-based and they want solution-focused or something applied. There is a joke among some of us who are from Asian countries, and apparently my friend in Brazil said this too, that in the home country, no matter what you went to the doctor for, you expected to get something. So if nothing else, you'd get like a vitamin shot. Because the idea that we just talked and you didn't give me anything seems really like, what are we doing here? And so even in therapy with immigrant communities, sometimes I'd be sure to be like, here's a resource, here's a pamphlet, here is something tangible about us wanting to support you and help you, right? And it may be for your current presenting problem, or you've mentioned that you need these things for your children or your grandmother or whatever. So definitely thinking about healing a system, providing something very practical, and naming things for what they are so it doesn't feel out of control. That I know in Oakland, we worked with people who'd been through pretty horrific war crimes and time in refugee camps. A lot of our clients had come from Cambodia. And I think our most powerful work, honestly, was in the group activities where they could get a little psychoeducation, name these things, normalize that this is a normal response to these sort of traumatic events, and really think about what are facets of resilience, how do people do more than just live? What does it mean to survive and come back to life? And the draw was often something practical. So the groups often really were happiest when they were planning a garden, which we had. Actually, a huge popular one was learning to make boba drinks, because one of the staff was teaching them how to make these things that you could sell. Or creating an artistic presentation for a community show, that something with growth, right? That we want to acknowledge and grieve what has happened, and then think about how do we move toward growth in a very practical way. Because for some of our communities, this whole like thinking about thinking sounds kind of strange, and they may not have had a lot of practice. Others may have, because CBT, ACT, DBT, all of those ways of thinking have existed in Buddhism, for example, for centuries. But Klein may not be Buddhist. So really kind of feeling out that fit for whoever you're working with or talking to.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that. We're getting a lot more questions coming in, so that's wonderful. Thanks, everybody. We have another question here. So this question is about working with, is less about working with patients and more about working with other providers. Mm-hmm. So this is from a question from a second-generation Asian American student who's often experienced and witnessed micro and macroaggressions from clinical preceptors and other providers towards Asian American clients, as well as other members of the BIPOC community. Mm-hmm. What is your approach to working alongside these providers and, quote, educating them when you're still in the student role?
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's a huge one, right? Ideally, you have some person who is not a student, who is an ally. I know that's not always available. In fact, you may not even have a peer. So one thing we do see in AAPA, our membership is majority students, because we will have many more providers in the future than we do now. But they are majority students, and the experience is wildly different if you're in a place that is resource rich, has a lot of community, versus if you feel like you are one of the only students who are BIPOC. And do you have any faculty or supervisors who are culturally responsive or not? And that varies pretty wildly. If you don't have any at your institution, it can be helpful. I think it's actually, for example, a lot of the reason people actually join an association like ABSI or APA is to find the mentors or the community if you lack it where you currently are. So there's that, like, how do you fortify yourself to have that reality check? Like, wait, is this how it's supposed to be? Like, what do other people do about this? How do I take care of myself when I'm feeling a certain kind of way, you know, insulted, worried, angry about what I'm seeing practiced here? There are established things like feedback mechanisms, but I know those are limited. I think also if you have allies, because of course we always need allies and accomplices, what are the feedback mechanisms? There's a real math or strategy in how much code switching do we tolerate to survive to get what we need, and how much do we need to stand up because this is actually causing patient harm. And in that case, finding a way to not address some of these things alone. There might be small things that can sometimes be brought up in case consult or supervision, depending on the openness of the supervisors. You know, we've certainly had meetings at our CAPS that people got defensive or things were testy, but we were able to address things like, you know, you repeatedly like using the wrong pronoun is a real issue. Or actually, I don't know if you noticed, you just made this assumption that the student was poor just because they're, you know, Vietnamese, and that was like way off and inaccurate. Like, are there little places where it can be tolerated safely for you to make some of these pointers and that people can actually take them in? And so that is a little bit of the emotional labor of always making these assessments. But I think for the student, I'd say, and what I've experienced, like, you find if there are openings where it is possible to point out, like, actually, South Asians are different than, Southeast Asians, and little places where the learning might happen in a training setting or in supervision. How much can you say that you feel like able to stand up for yourself, but then how much do you limit because it is not your job? And also it may not feel safe. But also, is there a higher authority to make comments and submit feedback from? Unfortunately, sometimes we can only do that when we also get our peers to give similar feedback, that has sometimes been powerful. Or a former mentee of mine left her site when she left and left a scathing series of reviews and recommendations, but they did actually follow up on many of them. But she didn't feel safe until she had left. So I think there's a real judgment there about how much and at what point, including in time, that you feel you're able to address some of these things. And this is where also having a mentor or an ally who's in the field and has more privilege and safety than you can be super helpful. Because otherwise, the only thing too is that I know for our field, for example, when the APA accreditation comes around, then suddenly there's a huge drive to do much better. So sometimes knowing that, well, surely you want to be like an outstanding agency and surely you want to be accredited, and sometimes bringing in an example, because there are times agencies just don't know how to do it. And they don't necessarily want to put in the effort, but if you bring in an example, it can be helpful. So I've often lifted up the YNA Health Comprehensive Center as an example of like, look, it's not really impossible to integrate Western medicine of the highest caliber with Indigenous counsel and community. Or when I wanted Stanford to create a website with information and resources addressing anti-Asian racism and harassment right now in this age of COVID and xenophobia, I brought up like, look, Harvard has this website and look what they have. And I have ideas how we could do something like this, but do it better at Stanford. And then that was like, oh, okay, we can do that. So sometimes you need an example too, because the commitment or the awareness of how to do this may also be missing from your organization.
Great, thank you so much. Looks like we have two more questions here. Let's see. So you mentioned that elder Asian Americans have a high suicide rate. And how can medical providers assess for risk with this population?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Assessing for risk. In general, assessing for suicide risk with Asian Americans is an area of study that is shifting right now. There's a small body of research that shows that it is expressed differently, and therefore some of the ways that we have traditionally taught suicide prevention may not actually pick up, which is really alarming. And elders are even more alarming because they are more likely to be linguistically isolated, transportation isolated, and generationally so. So I think the studies had shown thus far it was Asian female elders that tended to be the highest suicide and depression risk. So I think in the assessments, right, like really trying to stay tuned to changes in function and opportunities for connection is absolutely critical to this community. Traditionally in our ancestral homes, elders have a very prized central role in the family. I always find it fascinating whenever I visit Taiwan. Almost any TV commercial or billboard regularly depicts an intergenerational family. It's not, the nuclear family. There's always a grandma or grandpa, and that's kind of depicted as the icon of a happy family. Yet often some of these elders come to the United States. They They may or may not be able to drive. They may or may not live anywhere in your community. Sometimes the younger generation here really has no time for them. And so I think social connection is really the largest thing to assess. Like, is there some kind of a regular connection? Are they actually engaged in the healthcare activities that prevents depression and illness? Could we introduce something if there isn't? Can we engage like the other generations if possible? For example, in Alameda County here, there was an innovation grant that was given at the Oakland Asian Culture Center, where they offered elders a Qigong class. And so they came for Qigong, but they would get suicide screenings and basic mental health 101 information while they were there talking about wellness. And it was just beautiful, because if you ever ask them to come to a mental health event, there's no way they'd show up. But here was something that they could actually be together, do something healthy, and get the screening and information. So maybe thinking about how we do that, right? And elder Asians don't often maybe use the word depressed. So you may be screening more about the somatic symptoms, about fatigue, about pain, about indigestion, all these things, movements, and definitely sleep and appetite, the normal depression screenings. But it has also been shown that there tends to be much more somatic expression of symptoms. And I remember a colleague of mine who's a Black American who actually came to consult with me and said, you know, my client is saying things to me like, I feel like I have vinegar in my heart and I don't know what she means by that. And I said, yes, these are very common ways of talking about things. For example, in Chinese, like vinegar in my heart, like bitterness, you know, I'm eating bitterness. It's not, I have depression necessarily.
Awesome, thank you. I think that that piece about language and verbiage, I think, is so important, and I love that that colleague consulted with you on that. We do have a question about the vignettes. So, thinking about Amina's case, do you have suggestions for culturally specific bystander intervention strategies when the person being harmed is part of an API community, or different ideas for when the person is being harmed, or for when the person being harmed is a patient, student, or colleague, kind of thinking about power dynamics?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, bystander trainings right now. I have a few more resource slides I'll just show at the end that you could look up later, but I believe it's AAJC, the Asian American Justice Group, that have been giving bystander trainings right now in response to the explosion of anti-Asian harassment and hate. I think in New York City, it was something astonishing, like more than 1,000% increase in Asian harassment incidences. And so Stop AAPI Hate, that website I did put here, that was started by Dr. Jung at San Francisco State to log incidences, and have picked up thousands of incidences since he started the website. So thank you for asking that. Bystander training is a whole thing. How do we intervene? I think some of us had done some bystander training about, for example, intervening with Islamophobia when you see it, and now it's our community's turn, like the power of how do you actually do bystander intervention. Now, I think in Amina's case, that, you know, is modeled on a composite but real case that, I mean, the Afghan community, for one, you may find that some of them consider themselves Asian and some do not. They are from East Asia. The census calls them white. So it's very hard to track data on this population. But there is a very, very large Afghani population near me in Fremont, California. I believe the largest now outside of Afghanistan is actually in Fremont. It's where Kite Runner ends, the book. But this was difficult because staff had extremely strong personal reactions to Amina's situation, which frankly I found understandable, right? And yet there was a piece of like, where am I reacting and where am I trying to honor what Amina has chosen for her and her family, and am I able to help her maximize her functioning, given her choices and her situation. We've had situations like this, with like Amina's, where high school staff are completely so appalled by the family's choices, but then it can be very harmful and xenophobic about how the family is treated, right? That Amina has other things she wants to talk about in therapy besides this marriage. And this is really where I think the supervisor herself in the scenario really needed to seek support as well as consult, because it was very understandable to have a lot of feelings about this. And yet there was an ethical question of, but what is our duty and what is it not? And of course, cultural humility does not mean total cultural relativism, right? We're not excusing anything can go just because it's their culture. But where's that line? And for me, it's always health and safety. So if there's a mandated report, we're doing a mandated report. If there's a health and safety issue, we're pursuing it. In Amina's case, frankly, none of the staff really liked it, but she was safe. She chose this. It was within the bounds of her community and culture, and we had to find a way to work with what her stated goals were in therapy, and get the consult. And there have been times that we've decided that the intern couldn't continue the work, and there have been times we've had some that we decided they were able to. And actually, Amina's also a good example, because we tried to give her a Afghani-American psych trainee, and they did know each other through distant circles. So it was like, no, this absolutely cannot, she will need to be served by an outsider from the community. But then that staff and that supervisor needed to do a lot of consult. But yes, please look up AAGC for the bystander trainings, and I have this up, AAPI Hate website. And of course, I mentioned a lot of different organizations and resources. If you have questions about something I mentioned that I didn't put on the resources, of course, you can contact me later.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Dr. Hsu. It looks like that was all the questions we had so far. If there are any more questions, please feel free to reach out to CAP support at ohsu.edu.
Mm-hmm. And Stephanie just pointed out, so some of the resources that I wanted to share as we get toward the, more is, there is an absolutely fabulous PDF at the API Institute on gender-based violence that goes into far more detail than I was able to today, so I definitely recommend checking that out. API Legal Outreach provides a lot of legal information for actually survivors or anyone in the community. Rise Now is founded by Amanda Wen, and that's for empowering survivors. And just one of many examples of a great grassroots organization. So Bante Saray was founded in Oakland by young women who had been sexually trafficked and exploited. So Bante Saray is about Asian girls' empowerment, and they use all the things, movement and cooking and cultural therapies, but to really get at the roots of empowering a community that has faced a great deal of exploitation and trafficking, and all from a very culturally affirming stance. Stop API Hate, which I mentioned, AAJC, which I did not put on here, but you can find them. They have a huge web and Twitter presence. But in any of your work with AAPI clients this year, hopefully we'll see for years to come, this is very much on the mind of a lot of Asian Americans, is the absolute explosion of hate incidents that have risen. There was 1,400 reports in the first 3 weeks of the website being up. Lots of people being accosted with anti-Chinese slurs. They are not, at 60% not actually Chinese, but that doesn't matter. They were sort of slandered as a group. So far, reports from 46 states, a lot of attacks due to wearing masks. So that was also earlier during COVID. And Dr. Jung had mentioned that when he started this website to accrue the data, therefore to influence policy, he was surprised, he said, to see that actually women were 2 to 3 times more likely to face anti-Asian harassment. I found it not surprising at all, as we all know about intersectional identities that make us vulnerable. So Stop AAPA Hate is something we really encourage people to log every report, whether it's just verbal or it's an actual attack. And there are guides in multiple languages because a lot of our elders also don't know how to access these things. So a lot of the attacks are on elders right now, and they've tended to have like younger relatives help them log the incident reports. Okay. And just resources for the helpers and guides yourselves. This is really a time that I hope may we maximize our own mind-body health and keep working on that. Being reasonably healthy in midst of a crisis, a long chronic crisis, self-compassion in our work, also using that a lot with clients, anti-racism and racial trauma resources, really trying to understand the impact of all of this. We're all in crisis and have had disappointments and losses in this past year. Yet we're all also realizing the ways it has disproportionately hit some communities more than others. And so learning about that, how to fortify ourselves and how do we really reach out to the communities that are going to be most in need and actually recognize it. So the invisibility of some of the disparities and the anti-Asian violence has contributed to sort of the negative impact that there's been a lot of talk, for example, on Asian Twitter and social media about people feeling like, wow, how come these like violent incidents have not gotten more news or airplay? Like, does nobody care? Okay. And that's kind of, yeah, the resources there. And I'm happy to follow up with any. I am only on YouTube after the pandemic dragged me back on, but I'm very often on Twitter sharing resources. Clubhouse is the newest spot. There's a lot of great dialogues going on there as well. And happy to like follow up questions if you have some time to peruse the vignettes or resources and have follow up.
Great, thank you so much. This is being recorded, so we will send out a recording once that is finalized. And again, Dr. Hsu, really appreciate your time today.
Thank you so much. The great work. And would love to see, to pass on the hiring advocates job posting as well in our networks.